Alright guys, this will be our first video for APUSH for Wednesday, April 8th. We're talking about the effects of Second Great Awakening, the changes of culture in the antebellum period before Civil War. We just talked about Mormons yesterday. We're now going on to other areas like women's reform. Okay, the Second Great Awakening was only one source of the antebellum reform movements. By 1820s, 1830s, most of the founding fathers were dead, but they left a legacy of freedom and equality expressed in part of the Declaration of Independence, as well as the preamble of the Constitution. In the 1830s, we the people still meant white males. Many women were active in the abolitionist movement, and it was their exclusion from participation in a worldwide anti-slave convention in London in 1840 that convinced women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott to hold the first women's rights convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls in upstate New York, in the same burned-over district from the Second Great Awakening. Stanton and Mott, along with other reformers, published the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments of Women, which they molded after the American Declaration of Independence. The Declaration began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." 4 years later, Stanton would team up with Susan B. Anthony, with whom she founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, in 1869. Finally, Horace Mann was instrumental in pushing for public education and education reform in general. He lengthened the school year, established the first formal school for teacher training, and used the first standardized books in education. Mann is noted for his belief that education is the great equalizer. The abolition movement. Before the 1830s, few whites fought aggressively for liberation of slaves. The Quakers believed slavery to be morally wrong and argued for its end. Most other anti-slavery whites, though, sought gradual abolition, coupled with colonization and a movement to return blacks to Africa. The religious and moral fervor that accompanied the Second Great Awakening, however, persuaded more and more whites, particularly Northerners, that slavery was a great evil. As in other reform movements, women played a prominent role. White abolitionists divided into two groups. Moderates wanted emancipation to take place slowly and with the cooperation of slave owners. Immediatists, as their name implies, wanted emancipation at once. The most prominent among the immediatists was William Lloyd Garrison, a white man who began publishing a popular abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator in 1831 and helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. His earlier subscribers were mostly free blacks, but as time was passed, his paper caught on with white abolitionists as well. Garrison fought against slavery and against moderates as well, decrying their plans for black resettlement in Africa as racist and immoral. Garrison's persistence and powerful writing style helped force the slavery issue to the forefront. His message, as you may imagine, did not go over well with everywhere. Some southern states banned the newspaper and others prohibited anyone from discussing emancipation. While congregational debate over slavery became too heated, Congress adopted a gag rule that automatically suppressed discussion of the issue. It also prevented Congress from enacting any new legislation pertaining to slavery. The rule, which lasted from 1836 to 1844, along with white Southern restrictions on free speech, outraged many Northerners and convinced them to join the abolitionist movement. The abolition movement existed prior to 1830, but it had been primarily supported by free blacks. Abolition associations formed in every large black community to assist fugitive slaves and publicize the struggle against slavery. These groups met at a national convention every year after 1830 to coordinate strategies. In the 1840s, Frederick Douglass began publishing his influential newspaper, the North Star. Douglass, an escaped slave, gained fame as a gifted writer and eloquent advocate of freedom and equality. His narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is one of the great American autobiographies. Other prominent black abolitionists included Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery and then returned south repeatedly to help more than 300 slaves escape via the Underground Railroad. And Sojourner Truth, a charismatic speaker who campaigned for emancipation and women's rights. Abolitionist determination and the South's inflexibility pushed the issue of slavery into the political spotlight. Westward expansion and the question of whether slavery would be allowed in the new territories forced the issue further. Together they set in motion the events that led to the Civil War. So that ends Packet 4. We're now moving into Packet 5, this is going to cover, basically, this is where Unit 5 in the course guidebook picks up with James Polk, Mexican-American War, and then the road onward towards Civil War in general. So we're switching over to now Unit 5 in the course guidebook, APUSH key concepts, and now we're going to be reading from the Princeton Review Packet 5, which is heading toward Civil War and Reconstruction. Okay, political and judiciary activity before the war. The election of 1844 pitted James Polk against Whig leader Henry Clay. Though the differences between Whig and Democratic platforms may seem hazy by modern standards, and there was more than a little overlap, in one respect the two parties were sharply opposed. Above all else, the Whigs stood for a policy of internal improvements, building bridges, dredging harbors, digging canals, and in short, civilizing the lands the United States had already possessed. Democrats tended to be expansionists, set on pushing the nation's borders ever outward. They also felt it was not the government's place to do anything with newly added land, and it should instead be kept in private hands, even if it meant living in a country of meandering dirt roads instead of the railways. Compare Whig-dominated New England. Dotted with bustling towns and busy factories to the heavily Democratic South with its isolated plantations, and you have a sense of the two parties' desperate vision for America. The election was close, but Polk won the Polk presidency. Polk took office with 4 goals, and having pledged to serve only one term, had only 4 years to which to accomplish them. The first goal was to restore the practice of keeping government funds in the Treasury. Andrew Jackson had kept them in the so-called pet banks, and the results had been disastrous. The second was to reduce tariffs. Both of these were accomplished by the end of 1846. In the last days of his administration, President Tyler had proposed the annexation of Texas. Northern congressmen were alarmed. Texas was huge and lay entirely south of the Missouri Compromise line, raising the prospect that it might end up being divided into as many as 5 slave states. They demanded that Polk maintain the balance of demanding the entirety of the Oregon country, which stretched from Mexican territory of Alta California at 42 north up to the Russian territory of Alaska at 5440 north. 5440 or fight, they demanded. Yes, that was not Polk's slogan, but one directed at him. But Polk recognized that the United States could hardly afford to fight 2 territorial wars at the same time, particularly if one was against Great Britain, the other claimant to the Oregon country. Consequently, he conceded on demands for expansion deep into Canada and set about instead to negotiate a more reasonable American-Canadian border. The Oregon Territory, or Oregon Treaty, signed with Great Britain in 1846, allowed the United States to acquire peacefully what is now Oregon, Washington, and parts of Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. He also established the current northern border of the region. Reasonably certain that war in the Northwest could be avoided, Polk concentrated his efforts on claiming the Southwest from Mexico. He tried to buy the territory, and when that failed, he challenged Mexican authorities on the border of Texas, provoking a Mexican attack on American troops. Mexico was already agitated over the annexation of Texas, which had gained its independence from Mexico in 1836. Polk then used the border attack to argue for a declaration of war. Congress granted the declaration in 1846, and the Mexican-American War began. Whigs, such as first-term member of the House of Representatives, Abraham Lincoln, questioned Polk's claim that the Mexicans had fired first, but Congress declared war anyway. The Mexican-American War did not have universal support from the American public. Northerners feared the new states in the West would become slave states, thus tipping the balance in Congress in favor of pro-slavery forces. Opponents argued that Polk had provoked Mexico into war at the request of powerful slaveholders, and the idea that a few slave owners had control over the government became popular. Those rich Southerners also allegedly were pulling the strings, were referred to as the slave power by suspicious Northerners. The gag rule in 1836 raised suspicions of slave power, and the defeat of the Wilmot Proviso, a congressional bill prohibiting the extension of slavery into any territory from Mexico, reinforced these suspicions. The main thing to remember about the Wilmot Proviso is the outcome of the vote. Northerners, Whigs were all in favor. Democrats up north, all but 4 were in favor. Southerners, all but 2 opposed. All opposed. Democrats in the South. All right. As you can see, the vote fell along not party lines, but sectional ones, an ominous sign. Over the course of the next decade, the Democrats would become even more Southern-dominated than before, while the Whigs would split between the anti-slavery Northern conscious Whigs and the pro-slavery Southern Cotton Whigs, and would thus follow the Federalists into extinction. New parties would rise to take its place, the first of which was the Free Soil Party, a regional single-issue party devoted to the goals of the Wilmot Proviso. On a side note here, it has, naturally, abolitionists were opposed to the expansion of slavery, but as noted, abolitionists were a small group with very little political power. The primary opposition to the expansion of slavery came from white farmers and workers who didn't care about the welfare of slaves, but who didn't want to have to compete with slave labor. After all, it's hard to get a decent price for your crops when plantations have flooded the market, and it's hard to get hired for a decent wage when your employer can instead purchase slaves and force them to do the job for free. It's worth noting that many free states barred all African Americans from entering not only slave, but free free ones as well. We'll end video.